Previously on Yu-Gi-Oh! CG, we took a look at Booster 6. The influx of fusion support was great for not only the rogue strategy, but for general top decks. Cyberstein in particular would give Beatdown a quick fire damage provider by getting out Black Skull Dragon. Standard Beatdown and Exodia were still the top two decks where outside factors affected the overall metagame. Booster 6 and Hovering releases didn't change much in regards to the status quo, but it was a fun addition if anything, especially considering the fusion mechanic didn't have much going for it beforehand. But then on December 16th, everything would change with the release of the EX Starter Box. This pre-constructed deck box is similar to the starter box back in March. Not to compare the two, since this box included much more thoughtful decks that even included a side deck, where the starter box was more of a gimmick to promote and play Yu-Gi-Oh! At a casual level. The EX starter box had easier cohesion for new players to jump into what the game had evolved into throughout 1999. And even the reprint of the rulebook gave more availability to players to have a better understanding of certain intricacies such as the revival rule. It also reminded me that main phase 2 didn't exist at this point. Rather, after the battle phase, it would go back to the simple main phase and then to the end phase after that. Main phase 2 was added later as a way to describe this shift better. The box also contained plenty of new cards that we would recognize as the TCG's 2002 Yugi and Kaiba starter decks. So if you're in need of respectable cards that partially filled the gaps of cards you missed out beforehand, then cards like Wall of Illusion, Neo the Magic Swordsman, Lord of D, Flute of Summoning Dragon, and Judgment would be at your disposal. Speaking of, that last card was a solid 1 tribute beater if you didn't have Machine King and wanted more mid-level monsters than the reprinted Summon Skull. Yeah, it turns out this box gave needed reprints aplenty. Other great reprints include Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, and Trap Hole. This put players on an even playing field since cards like Dark Hole and Gaia the Fierce Knight haven't been reprinted since Volume 1. Even both Dark Magician and Blue Eyes White Dragon received reprints, with new arts no less. While this wasn't the first instance of this, looking at Flame Swordsman, this was a more notable move for Konami to make. Both Dark Magician arts would be based on the monster's appearance in the manga from Duel 62 and 94 respectively, whereas Blue Eyes' first art was from the manga, yet its second art is more of an unknown. I couldn't find any sources from its showings throughout its debut chapter through Duelist Kingdom, even if a variety of panels would wind up as alt art. My best educated guess is that we're aware that Takahashi designs monsters from a variety of angles and poses before he settles on a final design. Blue Eyes must have been a case of this, where Takahashi liked the alternate design enough to even want to use it in Forbidden Memories during early development. Many alternate art would go on to form counterpart cards, like Taihon and Taihon No. 2. My theory is that Takahashi and or Konami didn't want to muddy up popular manga cards like Dark Magician and Flame Swordsman and keep certain cards to have alternate art instead of having this second Blue Eyes card become a totally new, recolored card like, I don't know, Gold Eyes Scarlet Dragon. At the very least, it was a good promotional tactic. Hey, here's a new Dark Magician art. While it's sad that these decks didn't include a fusion deck to capitalize off of Booster 6, and the purpose of the set for that matter, duelists were okay with that when looking at the new power cards the EX Starter Box introduced. Guess Konami didn't want to reprint Polymerization again so quickly. The big trap here was Waboku. It protects yourself from battle damage for the turn as activated. At this time, no battle destruction protection. It's a great card to punish aggressive pushes and to slow the game down. Even though Swords of Revealing Light is better as a protection tool, having both be available in a deck only caused Beatdown's game plan to become nigh impossible in the face of specific decks like Exodia. So now Beatdown only had one real out, Morphing Jar. This ironically morphed the deck into something new, Anti-Meta Jar. On the other hand, the big spell was Last Will. This card has had a confusing history of rulings throughout the card game, and the OCG is no different. The card typically lets you summon a single 1500 or less attack potent monster from the deck should one of yours get sent to the field to the graveyard the turn you activate Will. Over in the OCG, the wording in its initial print was rather confusing, more or less reading, quote, "During the turn this card is activated, each time one of your monsters is sent to the graveyard, special summon one monster from your deck," unquote. So duelists assumed that this card could bring out as many monsters as one sent to the grave. This seemingly infinite rotation only powered the already fearsome Exodia deck to what could be considered a full power version. Will severely punishes any deck with beaters, since a player could just crash a monster to trigger Will manually. And since Will acts in a continuous state while it's in the graveyard after activation, your opponent can only stop it when it first hits the field. Even if your opponent didn't have a beater, the owner could just do other forms of manual triggering like Dark Hole and Tribute to the Doomed. Some duels would even run Last Day of Witch to destroy extra Exodia pieces for a search if need be. If you send Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest to the grave and trigger Will, not only do you get a summon, but a search as well. So you can imagine how Exodia would immensely benefit from this singular spell. After all, Exodia exclusively ran monsters that Will synergize with prior to its inception. This forced any contending deck to main deck Morphing Jars, even in the mirror match. On top of that, the Conga line of monsters also meant that Cannon Soldier gained considerable power when it came to dealing burn damage. If the Exodia deck needed a backup plan if key pieces were all in the grave, then by burning 16 monsters, you can win the game. Having a machine that can be easily searched by any of the searchers or Will meant it could fit in the strategy seamlessly without the worry of looking for it mid-game. At the very least, you can use it to auto-trigger a searcher or Will to get the primary strategy going. Cannon Soldier would even work as a deck of its own if you didn't like or have Exodia. After all, the 16 monsters needed for an OTK could be any, or if you played a single Cockroach Knight. This little bugger from Booster 4, when sent to the grave, could be returned to the top of the deck. Then Last Will would trigger, bringing this card back out, and the loop goes on from there. While not as popular as Exodia OTK, Cannon Soldier OTK was still representative of the inherent issues of the game as a whole. It is not hyperbolic to say that Yu-Gi-Oh's metagame completely collapsed. Now the card's functions were either to facilitate OTKs, or to stop them as fast as possible. The solitaire mindset meant that games could end on the first turn, since attacking didn't mean the same as it once did in the format's past. To ignore the opponent, which was in stark contrast to where the game was heading previously. Exodia reached its full potential in the most toxic of ways. Its best defense, as discussed in previous Yu-Gi-Oh! CG entries, was people seeing it ironically as a forbidden deck, aside from Exodia being tough to obtain, which is still true. The December 99 period featured another special event at Jump Festa 2000 between the 18th and 19th. This is an annual manga and anime convention to introduce new material like manga, films, games, merch, etc. At this event, there was a lottery for one of 3,000 copies of a prismatic secret rare Blue Eyes White Dragon. Beforehand, the card only received an ultra rare in the starter box and wouldn't get such a high rarity in Series 1 style until the 25th anniversary Ultimate Kaiba set in 2022. Although it did get the rarity in Duelist Road in 2015, and other relatively high rarities like Ghost Rare and Ultimate Rare at different points in between. Even if you're unable to win one of those luxurious cards, you could also pick up Premium Pack 2 at Jump Festa as well. This sequel to the notorious Premium Pack back at the Tokyo Dome contained only ritual monsters and the respective ritual spells. The lineup would actually be those that were the prize cards at the Duel Monsters National Tournament, but there, they were not only normal monsters, but sealed prizes, making them extremely rare and illegal for play. Due to the meta climate, rituals would still be a collector's item at best, and a casual deck at worst. For Blackluster Soldier would be an upgrade to the previous champion, Magician of Black Chaos. And if you were still dying for some kind of lottery prize, there was an external e-jump lottery going on that ended on December 23rd, with the winner being announced in the upcoming February. Winners would receive one of 1,000 copies of a traditional Chinese ultra-rare Blue Eyes. While the game was not available in the Chinese language, players over there could still play with OCG imports. It appears to be a collaboration between Konami and Hong Kong to advertise the game rather than tease a new language print. Sure, you have a Japanese Blue Eyes, but have you mastered the Chinese one? After all, in the manga, it's insinuated that there are copies of the legendary dragon outside of Japan, and since in lore there are only 4 copies printed, then you better attempt to win this Chinese copy to become just like Kaiba. Lastly, in regards to new material, there was an important page in Jump 3-4 2000. Its in-store date was on December 20th, hence why we're discussing it now. The key takeaway was the ruling clarification when it came to certain cards, such as Swords of Revealing Light staying on field, Crush Card Virus not staying on field, and Monster Reborn in relation to the Resurrection rule. This may have been the first instance of the Fusion Monster Revival rule change, where Jump 48 earlier in the year mentioned conditional monsters, Jump 3-4 mentions special procedures. It's just me inferring this, so take it with a grain of salt, that Konami changed their mind on Gale Dogra due to the potential of Cyberstein. What was the largest resolution was how Sangan and Witch work. It's now on paper that these searchers cannot trigger from hand, making cards like Magic Jammer and Tribute to the Doomed less potent. Though Doom could still destroy your searchers on the field, so, you could still play it. Though back in this time period, not everyone had access to Jump magazines or the internet. Thus, the prior use of the searchers would still apply in certain local areas for a few months. While historically the answer of the ruling was a yes-no, and you could argue the format is defined by day of release like EX, it's not far out of the question that this is what Konami have always intended for the cards to function. Therefore, I would decipher EX format as one where the searchers cannot be activated from the hand, considering it was only 5 days between the 2 items and still in 1999 before the next set. I mean, plenty of earlier formats included later released cards that weren't in core or booster sets. Early December also held the follow-up to the cancelled Tokyo Dome's first national conference that we know little to nothing about aside from the winners, and that this follow-up was held on December 5th. Main point being is that it was possible that the Searcher's rulings was also mentioned here prior to the EX box. So obviously the main impact in December was the EX starter box. Not only was it great for beginners, but for mid-level and high-level duelists alike. Like I mentioned earlier, the meta was OTK or anti-OTK. You only had 3 reasonable options. Exodia OTK, which was clearly the strongest yet most difficult to build. Cannon Soldier OTK, which was not as popular but still effective. And Anti-Meta Jar, which was like flipping a coin to it if it even worked in the face of Exodia. You did have casual level decks if you didn't like the horrendous meta, however don't expect to win any locals lest there was a consensus or not playing toxic cards, or the judge ruled Last Will to work otherwise. EX Beatdown, Blackluster Ritual, and technically Dragon Turbo exists now thanks to the new Lord of D and Flute of Summoning Dragon, which would protect dragons from targeted effects and special summon or special set dragons from your hand respectively. Yeah, you could special set during this. Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG in 1999 was a tempestuous time with plenty of core sets that affected the meta in both minute ways and major ways. It had to work plenty to become a game with depth. That depth would wind up at the bottom of the ocean when the concept of regular play got shafted in favor of single-player affairs. But what do you all think? What's your favorite 1999 format? Would Yu-Gi-Oh! Be able to pick itself back up come the new millennium, or would the final stretch of Series 1 end by OTKing itself? And if you made it this far, here's a bonus treat. To close out 1999 Yu-Gi-Oh!, let's briefly discuss one thing I missed, and that's the Jump Novel Lottery Prize. This was a competition advertised in Jump Novel 16, released on September 25th, 1999. The lottery was held as a commencement of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Novel at the beginning of the month. It's a novelization of the first 2 story arcs of the manga, as well as a section with an original story where Yugi winds up battling a cyber Kaiba after the events of Death T. Winners would receive, along with many other prizes, a telephone card to pay for telephone services. But this one looked like a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card. Imagine playing your Yu-Gi-Oh! With stats of 100,000 attack and defense. Too strong. That screams, schoolyard, this is legal. What a novel concept. Anyways, make sure to subscribe to the Janjo Zone for future historic Yu-Gi-Oh! Content.